Black woman slapped by flight attendant. Turns out she owns the private jet. Mariah Johnson stood at the edge of the tarmac, her hoodie pulled low over her forehead, shielding her face from the blazing afternoon sun and, more usefully, from the presumptive stares that always came when a black woman in casual attire lingered too long near things meant for the wealthy. The Gulfstream G700 in front of her glimmered like a silver bullet parked for someone else, someone whiter, taller, louder, and less invisible than she had grown used to being. Still, she clutched her small Louis Vuitton crossbody bag with one hand, and pulled the hood back just slightly as the stairs descended slowly and a tall, primly dressed blonde woman with icy blue eyes and a flight attendant's practiced smile stepped down halfway to greet her. "Mom," the woman said without warmth, eyes narrowing, scanning for a clipboard, a sign, a security escort, anything to tell her this woman wasn't lost. "I'm sorry, but this jet isn't open to the public. You must be looking for the regional terminal." Mariah met her eyes calmly, blinking slowly, offering nothing yet. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice low, composed, professional, with just enough authority to unsettle the woman without giving her anything concrete to reject. The woman's name tag read Paige. Paige tilted her head, that tight-lipped smile returning with a patronizing sharpness. "And do you have a boarding pass or—" She trailed off, holding her hand out palm, up as if Mariah were about to pull out a handwritten excuse or a Starbucks receipt from her bag. Mariah reached instead into her phone and pulled up a simple QR code, held it toward Paige. It was real, it was official. It was already scanned and logged by the charter service an hour ago. But Paige stared at it like it was forged, like it was a trap. "And you're flying today on this jet?" she said, her voice trying to sound polite, but unable to hide the sour taste behind the question. "Yes," Mariah replied, stepping up the stairs calmly, walking right past Paige with a level of quiet authority that didn't need to be explained or justified. She didn't ask for permission. She wasn't interested in being liked. She just moved. Paige stiffened but said nothing yet. Inside the cabin, Mariah inhaled the sterile luxury, the scent of soft Italian leather, chilled air recycled from pristine filters, the silence only broken by the faint hum of unseen generators. She sat near the front, a single seat on the left side near the window. She placed her bag gently at her feet. Another woman, a younger brunette in a business suit, already seated and talking into an AirPod, gave her a once-over, then turned away dismissively. Mariah was used to that. She was used to 1,000 small slights that didn't bleed but cut nonetheless, moments that told her she was never quite where they thought she should be, no matter how many zeros sat behind her name. She pulled out a small tablet and began reading an internal strategy memo on her aviation startup's latest acquisition. A small private airfield in Nevada that was going to make her competitors eat dust within a year. But she didn't rush. Mariah knew the game. They never saw her coming when she was quiet. Paige entered the cabin moments later and walked briskly toward the cockpit, whispering something to the pilot and another crew member. Their eyes darted toward Mariah, and then quickly looked away. Paige returned, now donning her flight attendant persona in full. She walked the aisle with that clipped confidence, offering only mechanical glances to the passengers who looked like they belonged. Two white men in tailored suits, one middle-aged and portly, the other young with a Rolex he kept checking like it was part of his identity. Neither spoke to Mariah. She didn't need them to. The door sealed. The cabin dimmed. They were preparing for departure. Paige approached with a tray of drinks, offering sparkling water, champagne, and freshly squeezed juices with robotic grace. She skipped Mariah's row, walked right past it as if the seat were empty. One of the men chuckled under his breath. Mariah exhaled slowly through her nose, not reacting. Paige walked back up the aisle again with hot towels and napkins. Again she ignored Mariah. It was subtle, careful, deniable. And that's how the game was always played. It wasn't the violence of slurs or screaming. It was the micro-aggression of erasure. It was the delicate, curated insult of being unseen when you're sitting front and center. "Excuse me," Mariah said finally, her voice carrying gently but firmly through the cabin. Paige turned as if startled. "Yes," she said, as if the voice had come from somewhere illegitimate. "You missed me," Mariah said, pointing calmly to the drink cart. Paige blinked, then smiled. "Oh. I assumed you brought your own. Most of the staff usually sit in the back," she said, trying to frame it like a misunderstanding, not an accusation. "I'm not staff," Mariah said, her voice flatter now. "I'm a passenger." Paige's eyes flinched, but her face didn't move. "Of course. My apologies," she said, though the words came out like dry paper. She handed Mariah a towel and poured a drink without asking her preference. "Enjoy your flight," she said, walking away before a response could form. Mariah leaned back, sipping slowly. Every action now was a choice. She had built her empire by being underestimated. But there was a difference between being underestimated and being insulted. And Paige had crossed that line before the plane even left the runway. As the plane taxied, Paige continued to make rounds, smiling brighter at the suited men, refilling their champagne, calling them Mr. Dawson and Mr. Lively, with excessive reverence. Mariah never got a last name, she got silence. She got hesitation, she got micro-checked and half-served and ignored. It was all too familiar. She remembered this feeling from 1,000 rooms. Venture capital boardrooms where they called her, young lady, while stealing her ideas. Country clubs where she was assumed to be a guest's assistant. Gallery openings where people stood in her light to ask if she was the caterer. Even her alma mater had sent her fundraising emails that began, "Dear Mr. Johnson." Now, up here at 30,000 feet, the game hadn't changed. They just played it with more expensive pieces. Mariah stared out the window. The clouds rolled by in soft white towers. Her reflection in the glass looked calm, but her mind was sharpening. Paige didn't know who she was. None of them did. And that was going to be her greatest weapon. By the second hour of the flight, the tension had hardened into routine. Paige became more passive-aggressive, deliberately bumping Mariah's seat while walking the aisle, slamming the overhead compartment closed just above her head, making snide little comments under her breath while fluffing pillows and offering snacks to everyone else. Mariah didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. Not yet. But she made a note of everything. Her tablet, still open on her lap, now had a blank note titled Flight 473 G700 June 7, 2025. Underneath, she typed Paige Walker, blonde, hostile. Denied service 3 times, verbal slight at hour 1, physical bump at 1.5, intentional exclusion of amenities. Witnesses seat 3A2C, 1 behavior pattern. Race-based microaggression escalating to open disrespect. She had compiled these notes before. It wasn't paranoia, it was data. She didn't build her empire by guessing. She built it by documenting what the world tried to pretend didn't exist. Suddenly, a sharp turbulence jostled the plane. Not major, just enough to lift a few drink glasses. Paige rushed over to one of the male passengers, fussing over his now slightly stained cuff, apologizing profusely. Then, without thinking, she turned and hissed at Maria, "Can you please secure your things properly next time? We don't need messes up here." Mariah looked at her, eyebrows raised slightly. I was sitting completely still. Paige narrowed her eyes. "I saw your bag," she snapped. "Just, be more careful. We have standards up here." And that's when it happened. Paige, caught between her own prejudice and mounting embarrassment, reached down to Mariah's bag, grabbed it by the strap, and tried to shove it under the seat in a dramatic flourish of fake helpfulness. Mariah held it firmly. "Don't touch my bag," she said, her voice now hard. Paige's expression cracked. "Excuse me," she snapped, still tugging slightly. Mariah stood, slowly, and then Paige slapped her. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even that hard, but it was fast, open-palmed. A sharp strike across the left cheek. The cabin froze. The other passengers gasped. Someone said, "Whoa." Another whispered, "Did she just?" And Paige suddenly realized what she'd done. Her hand hovered midair. Her face pale. Mariah didn't stagger. She didn't raise her voice. She looked Paige directly in the eye and said, "You made a mistake." Paige backed up, already babbling, I didn't mean. I was just. Your tone was aggressive, and you lunged, but it was all noise now. Mariah slowly sat back down, reached into her bag, pulled out a sleek phone, and typed in a number. 1 ring. 2. "It's me," she said when the line picked up. "Yes, we have a situation." She glanced around the cabin. The suited men were now pretending not to see, shifting awkwardly, suddenly uncertain about their own superiority. "I want the personnel report on this flight sent to my office. Name's Paige Walker. Flight 473 Gulfstream G700. I'll be landing in ground intervention." Quietly. No headlines yet. She hung up, put the phone away and closed her eyes. The plane flew on. The silence was now reverent. What Paige didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the boarding pass nobody checked belonged to the woman who signed the fuel contracts. The woman who brokered the merger that gave this fleet its international range. The woman who paid for the Italian leather seats they now sat in while questioning her presence. And above all else, what they didn't know was that this wasn't the first time Maria Johnson had been slapped by someone who mistook her for the help. But it was going to be the last time they got away with it. The cabin had fallen into an eerie, unnatural stillness. One that hung over the passengers like a heavy, unspoken verdict waiting to be read aloud. Paige had returned to the front of the jet, visibly shaken but trying to hold on to whatever tatters remained of her authority, her smile reduced to a nervous twitch at the corner of her lips. She fumbled through her duties now, stacking glasses with trembling hands, flipping through the in-flight service manual even though she had every page memorized. Her mind was reeling, unsure whether the slap she had delivered to Mariah would go unnoticed or remembered. Meanwhile, Mariah sat entirely still, her expression calm but distant, her eyes fixed on the thick clouds swimming past the window. She did not touch her drink. She did not respond to the awkward glances from the passengers nearby. And she did not speak again. Silence was no longer just a statement, it had become her weapon. One man, a middle-aged executive across the aisle who'd earlier snorted at the idea of a hoodie, wearing black woman in first class, now looked at her with uneasy curiosity, as though trying to fit her into a different category than the one he had assigned her just an hour ago. He fidgeted with his watch, then his cufflink, then stared back out his window, too cowardly to confront what he had just witnessed but too aware to ignore it. For Mariah, the silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. Her mind was moving like a jet engine, quietly and powerfully, cataloging every moment since boarding, replaying every slight, every dismissive glance, every word that Paige had chosen to weaponize against her presence. It was the same tired choreography of assumptions she had danced through her whole life, only now the stakes had risen because the altitude had. The irony didn't escape her. Here she was, a billionaire, flying in a jet she effectively owned, being treated like an intruder, a problem, a disruption to white comfort. She knew the look Paige had given her when she boarded. It wasn't confusion, it was defiance. Paige hadn't asked for identification because she needed to check it. She had done it because she couldn't fathom someone like Mariah belonging somewhere like this. And when the facts didn't match her assumptions, Paige chose aggression over humility. That slap had not been just about ego. It had been about reclaiming control, about putting Mariah back in the box her skin and clothes and silence had refused to allow. Mariah's phone buzzed gently in her lap, vibrating beneath her fingers with the coded rhythm of confirmation. Her assistant had received the message, and her legal team was already preparing a report. They didn't need to ask for details. They had seen this pattern play out before, though never quite this directly. Never this brazen. She tapped the screen once, no words, just a thumbs-up emoji sent back, silent but definitive. There would be consequences, but not the kind Paige was bracing for. Mariah didn't believe in public humiliation unless it served a purpose. She wasn't looking for an apology. Apologies were currency for people with something left to lose. Paige would lose something else: her illusion of superiority, her imagined immunity, her comfort in treating black excellence like a threat instead of a presence. And that loss would come not with fanfare, but with quiet, professional certainty, paper trails, policy changes, and restructuring announcements issued in clipped press releases and strategic terminations. The most powerful people Mariah knew rarely raised their voices. They simply pressed send. Still, beneath her composed exterior, a quiet ache lived in Mariah's chest. Not just from the physical sting of the slap, which had already faded, but from the deeper bruising of dignity. She had worked so hard, so precisely, to build a world in which she couldn't be denied her seat, her space, her sky, and yet, even now, she was being measured by her melanin before her mind. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. But it was exhausting. And more than that, it was isolating. Because when you are a black woman at the top, there is no manual for navigating the rage that comes from being disrespected by people who work for you. And there is no one waiting with open arms to comfort you when you descend back to the earth and back into your body. The clouds outside looked soft enough to sleep on, but she was wide awake. Her brain, her blood, her breath, everything pulsed with clarity. Every white noise hum in the cabin felt like static from a world that still refused to tune into her frequency. Paige, still rattled, began circulating again, avoiding Mariah's row entirely now, not out of spite but out of fear. She leaned into the performance for the other passengers, overcompensating with smiles and exaggerated friendliness, as if to rewrite the narrative in real time. See, I'm helpful. I'm professional. That woman back there must have misunderstood me. But Paige's hands shook slightly each time she reached for a glass. Her face was pale, and everyone who had witnessed the incident had gone from casual ignorance to awkward awareness. Nobody said anything, of course. Not the suited men, not the stylish woman reading her Kindle, not even the young influencer type who'd snapped a silent selfie with the airplane logo in the background earlier. They all felt the disturbance in the atmosphere, but none of them dared speak it into existence. That would require more courage than their expensive shoes and curated lives had ever prepared them for. The young woman across from Maria, seat 2C, the one with the AirPods, finally leaned over slightly, eyes darting around nervously. I saw what happened, she whispered. That was completely out of line. Mariah didn't answer at first. The woman continued, fumbling. If you need someone to, vouch or something. I mean, I'd be willing. Mariah turned slowly toward her, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I don't need vouching. I need accountability." The woman blinked, unsure whether she'd just been thanked or dismissed. Mariah turned back to the window, ending the interaction. She didn't need sympathy. Sympathy was for the wounded. She was not wounded, she was sharpening. Outside, the sun had begun to fall below the horizon line, casting the cabin in soft orange and lavender hues. The lighting system flicked into evening mode, creating a cocoon of quiet elegance. But for Maria, it only deepened the contrast between the plane's aesthetic luxury and its human failures. She had designed jets like this. Her company had engineered interiors that merged cutting-edge comfort with environmental efficiency. She had sat with architects and aerospace engineers, drawn sketches on cocktail napkins in lonely hotels after board meetings filled with patronizing nods. She had flown around the world, from Shanghai to Johannesburg to Sao Paulo, building a brand that redefined private aviation as something not just for the elite, but for the equitable. And yet here she was, being treated as if she didn't belong in the very space she had reimagined. The audacity of it wasn't just offensive. It was tragic, because it revealed just how far society still had to go, even when sitting at 30,000 feet. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift, not to sleep, but to calculation. The acquisition she had finalized last week gave her a controlling interest in 3 regional airlines and 1 luxury charter conglomerate. The parent company of this very flight. She hadn't flaunted it. She didn't need to. But now, she considered the opportunity that had landed in her lap, not just to address the incident, but to rewrite the culture that allowed it. She imagined a training program, one rooted not in PR-friendly diversity checklists but in lived experience. She imagined new hiring protocols, new accountability structures, even a platform for passengers to report biases without fear of being gaslit or ignored. She imagined using this moment not for revenge, but for revolution. The idea steadied her. Then came the intercom. The pilot's voice, low and professional, announced that they were beginning their descent into Chicago. Estimated time to landing, 25 minutes. Mariah opened her eyes. She watched as the cabin lights brightened slightly, and Paige scurried to prepare for arrival. She still refused to meet Mariah's gaze. That was fine. The reckoning would not come from eye contact. It would come from consequences. Mariah pulled out her phone one final time and opened a secure app used only by her board. In it, she typed 3 short sentences and pressed submit. An executive action triggering the internal review of all staff involved in this flight. Within an hour, HR protocols would be activated. Within a day, statements would be gathered. Within the week, Paige's name would no longer be on the company's active employee list. There would be no headlines. No viral video. Just a closed door and a revoked badge. And Mariah would not lose sleep over it. As the jet touched down on the long stretch of glimmering tarmac, the wheels kissed the runway with a soft thud, and the engines whispered their surrender to gravity. Mariah didn't move. She let the other passengers collect their things first. She wasn't in a rush. Power rarely is. The suited men rushed out with mumbled goodbyes to Paige, avoiding Mariah's eyes altogether. The influencer type offered a sheepish wave that Mariah ignored. Only the young woman from 2C looked back, guilt still clinging to her like static. Mariah said nothing. Finally, Paige stood by the door, her posture stiff as she said to Mariah, "Thank you for flying with us." It was a broken attempt at civility. Mariah paused at the threshold, turned slightly, and said, "You should learn who your passengers are before you choose how to treat them." Then she stepped onto the staircase, into the open evening air. Waiting below, in front of a sleek black SUV, stood 2 individuals in dark suits with earpieces. One of them opened the door with a quiet nod. "Ms. Johnson," he said. "The board is informed. All internal steps have been initiated." Maria nodded once, stepped into the vehicle, and closed the door behind her. Behind her, up on the aircraft, Paige stared out from the cabin door, the corners of her perfect smile finally dissolving. She had misjudged a woman she thought was invisible. But Mariah Johnson had never been invisible. She had simply chosen not to be seen, until it mattered. The slap itself had been quick, almost ephemeral. A flick of motion that lasted less than a heartbeat but detonated in the cabin like an explosion muffled only by altitude. For a moment it was as if time had stumbled, tripped over its own feet, and landed in a stunned silence where every molecule of air felt like it was holding its breath. The sound, crisp and echoing, seemed to bounce off the leather seats and polished panels, weaving its way through the pressurized silence and finding residence in every witness's memory. No one expected it. No one prepared for it. 1 second, Maria was standing still, her chin high, her voice calm but firm, and the next, her head had been jerked slightly to the side, a red bloom forming on her cheek, and the woman in the navy blue flight uniform, Paige, stood with her hands still in the air, her eyes wide with the ghost of her own action. The slap was not merely physical, it was symbolic, a rupture in the unspoken contract between staff and passenger, between decorum and discipline, between prejudice and power, and everyone felt it. The cabin had become a theater, and that slap was the climax of an act no one had been brave enough to acknowledge was unfolding. The older couple too rose back. The man with the cufflinks and the woman with the pearl earrings froze mid-sip of their champagne. The influencer-type girl with the oversized sunglasses lowered her phone just a few inches, uncertain whether to document what had just happened or pretend she hadn't seen it. A businessman who had been pretending to nap jolted upright, glancing between the two women with his mouth slightly open, as though still waiting for someone to tell him it was all a misunderstanding. But there was no mistaking what they had seen. A flight attendant had slapped a black woman in first class, unprovoked, uncalled for, unjustified, and in doing so had ripped open a wound larger than the dimensions of the jet's narrow aisle. The air wasn't just thin from altitude anymore. It was dense with tension, with the weight of history compacted into that singular moment, as if every injustice ever slipped beneath a smile had suddenly screamed. And Mariah did not scream. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She stood perfectly still, her face turned slightly in the direction of the impact, her eyes slowly blinking as if calibrating the magnitude of what had just occurred. Her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, curled into quiet fists. Not out of rage but restraint. There was something more terrifying than fury in her posture control. Where Paige's hand had moved without thought, Mariah's entire body had responded with deliberate stillness. As if she had learned long ago that stillness was how you survive humiliation when the world doesn't expect you to. A lesser woman might have raised her voice, demanded to speak to the captain, called the police, or erupted in righteous indignation. But Mariah had no interest in reaction, she was calculating consequence. She had learned in boardrooms, in meetings, in media interviews and silent hotel elevators that power was not always loud. It was strategic. And in that moment, her silence was not submission. It was the slow drawing of a bowstring. Paige, meanwhile, was already unraveling. Her hand dropped to her side like a dead weight, as if only now had the gravity of what she'd done begun to drag her down. She opened her mouth as if to explain, but the words died before they could leave. What could she say? That she hadn't meant it. That it wasn't what it looked like. That somehow, the sheer audacity of a black woman in designer sneakers, refusing to obey her had short-circuited her judgment. She tried to speak. Something about protocol, or attitude, or feeling threatened. But her voice cracked under the strain of unrehearsed accountability. She had never had to explain herself to someone she'd already dismissed. The training manuals hadn't prepared her for this kind of moment. The scripts she had rehearsed for dealing with difficult passengers hadn't accounted for the possibility that the difficult passenger might own the plane. The passengers said nothing, but their silence was not neutral. It was indictment wrapped in cowardice. No one stepped forward to defend Paige. No one reached for Maria to ask if she was okay. It was the kind of bystander paralysis that had haunted history, that echoed in headlines after every injustice caught on camera. Only now, there was no camera, no phone recording, no viral video. There was only memory, and in that memory, each passenger would later confront the guilt of inaction, the shame of complicity. They had all been shaken, yes, but only one of them had been struck. And in that imbalance was the true horror. Mariah slowly turned her head back toward Paige, her eyes locking onto the woman's face with a precision that felt surgical. Her voice, when it came, was low and even, but laced with a finality that felt like a gavel dropping. "You just made a career-ending decision," she said, her voice not rising but sinking, digging deep beneath the skin where it would echo later, long after the cabin emptied. "And you don't even know who I am." Paige stammered, but Mariah raised a hand, not to strike, but to silence. "You will," she said. And then she turned, walked back to her seat with the slow grace of someone who had already moved beyond this moment in her mind, and sat down as though the universe had just rearranged itself around her. And perhaps it had. The energy in the cabin was permanently altered. The slap hadn't just shaken people. It had recalibrated their understanding of the space they occupied. What had begun as another luxury flight, complete with champagne and corporate distance, had become a morality play at 40,000 feet. And the lead character was not the flight attendant, nor the men in suits who had thought themselves the VIPs. It was Mariah. The woman in the hoodie, the woman who spoke Dutch, the woman who owned the silence and the space, and now, most importantly, the story. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in air pressure, now seemed to orbit around her. And Paige felt it. She felt the collapse of the illusion she had lived in. The illusion that her role, her whiteness, her uniform could protect her from consequences. That power looked like a clipboard and a smile and a little authority over drinks and seating arrangements. She had never been in a position where she couldn't reset the narrative with a forced apology or managerial jargon. But Mariah wasn't just another passenger. She was a mirror. And in that mirror, Paige was forced to see herself. Not as the professional she imagined, but as the symbol she had become. The enforcer of a caste system she hadn't even realized she upheld until her hand betrayed her. By the time the plane began its final descent, Paige was visibly crumbling. She had retreated to the staff galley, whispering into the phone with her supervisor, likely spinning the story as a misunderstanding or miscommunication, unaware that the decision had already been made far above her pay grade, because while she had spent the last hour trying to salvage her job, Maria had quietly alerted the very system that would erase her from it. The irony was brutal. Paige had slapped a black woman she assumed was beneath her, and in doing so, had handed that woman all the leverage she needed to dismantle her authority, her employment, her career. Mariah didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She knew the difference between revenge and justice. One was noisy and temporary, the other was silent and irreversible. As the wheels touched down and the engines roared their soft decrescendo, Mariah glanced once more out the window. She saw the ground rushing up to meet them, and with it, the end of this chapter, and the beginning of something much larger. The slap that had shaken the cabin would not be contained by the fuselage of a private jet. It would travel through HR departments, through boardrooms, through whispered industry warnings about the woman who had dared to strike a billionaire and discovered she had just struck a match. The flight ended as abruptly as it had begun. No one rushed off. No one dared speak to Paige. And when Mariah finally rose, she moved slowly again. Not because she was tired, but because she understood the power of timing. Power isn't just about what you do. It's about when you do it. She was the last to disembark, escorted not by a flight attendant, but by her own driver waiting at the tarmac, door open, eyes forward. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. She knew the look on Paige's face by heart already. Because Mariah had been slapped before, not physically, perhaps, but in every room where she was overlooked, underestimated, talked over, dismissed. Every time she had walked into a meeting only to be mistaken for the assistant. Every deal that had taken twice as long because her intelligence had to be confirmed first. Every handshake that came only after the man realized she wasn't the intern. The slap was just the physical manifestation of a much older insult. But unlike the others, this one came with consequences. And as the vehicle pulled away, Mariah leaned back in the leather seat, pulled out her phone, and opened the draft of a press release she hadn't yet finished. The title read, Baez at 30,000 feet. A personal statement from Mariah Johnson. She hadn't decided if she would release it. She didn't need to, because she knew that the most powerful slap wasn't the one delivered in anger. It was the one that came after the slap of reality, of retribution, of revelation. And Paige would feel that slap long after the red on Mariah's cheek had faded. At 39,000 feet, suspended somewhere between the rigid expectations of the world below and the invisible borders of the world above, Mariah placed a single AirPod into her right ear and made a quiet call that would become the fulcrum upon which the entire weight of the situation would turn. No one noticed. Not the trembling flight attendant hiding behind the galley curtain, not the passengers still paralyzed by guilt and discomfort, and certainly not the men who still believed themselves to be the most important figures aboard simply because they wore suits and owned mutual funds. But power, real power, often announces itself in silence, and this call, short, calm, and coded in language few on that plane would understand, was power slipping through the clouds like a whispered storm. She didn't dial through the in-flight Wi-Fi or use some flashy app. She had access to a private, encrypted satellite network known to only a sliver of the world's elite, designed for scenarios precisely like this one, where discretion was paramount and action was immediate. Her fingers moved with the ease of ritual, muscle memory carved from years of executive decisions and the burden of empire hidden behind her calm exterior. Her voice, once the line connected, dropped into a tone only those who worked under her umbrella understood. Not loud, not rushed, but laced with that rare clarity that turns instructions into inevitabilities. A run, she said, not as a greeting, but as a key unlocking a protocol. On the other end of the line, her chief of operations didn't waste time asking how the flight was. He could tell by the cadence in her voice that this wasn't a social call. I want her flagged, Maria continued. The name's Paige. Flight attendant. Skylux Aviation. A pause. A faint exhale from her nostrils. I want full background. Training, complaints, employment history, social media, everything. She didn't need to raise her voice. The authority threaded into her syllables traveled like a current. and send a courtesy note to Claridge. Let him know I'm deeply disappointed with the level of discretion on his aircraft. I expect better from private partners. Another pause. Have PR prepare 2 responses, one internal, one public. I don't know yet how loud this needs to get, but I want both in my inbox by the time I land. Arun didn't ask questions. He simply responded with, "Yes, Mom," and the call ended, not with a goodbye, but with the soft finality of someone hanging up because the decision had already been made. Outside the window, clouds drifted like sheets pulled slowly across the sky, weightless and blind to the quiet reckoning taking place within the cabin. No one else knew that the tremor of change had already begun, seated by a phone call no longer than 60 seconds. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, and certainly wasn't something Paige could feel yet. But the machinery of accountability had been activated behind the curtain of corporate infrastructure Mariah controlled. From global HR databases to private equity connections, from the subtle nudges of political contacts to the indirect influence over aviation regulators, Mariah's reach was not measured in followers or applause. It was measured in action, swift and invisible. The kind that could rearrange a career before the victim even knew she'd lost it. As the call ended, Mariah tucked the AirPod back into its case and sat still for a moment, her thumb grazing the edge of her cheek where Paige's hand had left its print hours earlier. The sting had faded, but the mark remained. Not on her skin, but on the story that had now wrapped itself around this flight. She wasn't angry in the traditional sense. She had transcended that long ago. Anger was too narrow, too reactionary. What she felt was something colder, cleaner, an electric clarity, a confirmation. This wasn't just about a slap. This was about how easily the world assumed her place, her value, her role. She had boarded the plane in quiet, in leisure, in comfort, wearing the trappings of someone who knew how to exist without demanding the spotlight. But the moment she refused to play the script, the moment she didn't shrink or defer, she became a target. That was the part that always stayed the same. Her power threatened people before she even spoke. But she was done with silence now. Or rather, she was done with using it only as defense. Silence could be a sword too, when wielded correctly. And that was what the call represented. Not revenge. Not escalation. Just the shift from patience to precision. Her quiet call had set in motion a process Paige could never undo, a dossier building brick by digital brick, legal review teams being looped in, 2 major investors receiving alerts, and a subtle email forwarded to a board member of the charter company, tagged with the subject line, reputational risk assessment, immediate review. It was almost laughable how easy it all was. But that was the thing about structural power. When you truly have it, you don't need to shout. You just press one button, and the gears turn for you. Maria leaned back, her posture composed but alert. She watched a glass of sparkling water tremble slightly on the tray beside her, catching the subtle vibrations of the engines. Even the jet, sleek and insulated, couldn't completely hide its power. Neither could she. Somewhere in the cabin, Paige had resumed moving, passing down the aisle with the hollow expression of someone pretending everything was normal, while knowing the floor beneath her was crumbling. She avoided Maria's eyes. Not out of shame, but confusion. She still didn't fully grasp what she had done. To Paige it had been a loss of temper, a mistake, a single moment of misjudgment. She didn't understand yet that the moment she struck Mariah, she struck everything Mariah represented. Every boardroom she'd dominated, every company she'd quietly acquired, every door she'd forced open with nothing but brilliance and grit. Paige had slapped a legacy. And legacy doesn't forgive lightly. One of the male passengers finally mustered the courage to approach Mariah as the flight edged closer to descent. He introduced himself as a partner at a law firm, offering assistance, solidarity, perhaps even protection. Mariah listened with a polite smile, thanked him and declined. She didn't need defense. She was the storm. What she wanted wasn't a legal ally, but something far simpler, a reckoning. Not just for Paige, but for the assumption embedded in the slap itself. The idea that a black woman alone in luxury must justify her presence. That her silence was weakness. That her elegance was not earned but borrowed. Mariah wasn't here to punish Paige personally. Paige was just a symptom. What Mariah wanted was to expose the system that allowed someone like Paige to feel entitled enough to act on impulse and expect impunity. As the jet began its final descent, the skyline of the destination city sparkled beneath the cloud cover. An indifferent glitter of a world still in motion, still unaware of the small earthquake that had just occurred above it. The passengers stirred, collected their things, adjusted their personas. But for Mariah everything had already shifted. She had made the call, set the tone, defined the narrative. By the time they landed, the ripples would already be in motion. The statement drafts would be waiting. The internal report on Paige's past behavior would already be half compiled. And perhaps, more crucially, the charter company's legal team would already be evaluating the exposure risk of keeping an employee whose actions could turn into a PR nightmare. Mariah didn't need to threaten them. They'd do the math themselves. And math, unlike prejudice, was incorruptible. As the wheels touched the runway and the plane began to taxi, Mariah opened a note on her phone, scrolled through the 2 prepared statements and began editing. She struck through one sentence, added another, changed, incident, to assault. Words mattered, and she knew which ones would be picked up by the press if the time came. She was preparing for every possibility. Not because she expected escalation, but because preparedness was part of her DNA. You don't become a billionaire by improvising. You anticipate. You control the narrative before it controls you. Outside the cabin window, the ground crew moved in place, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded just meters above their heads. A world away, the internal communications at Skylux Aviation were already lighting up. Executives were whispering. Lawyers were looped in. Screens were filled with Slack messages bearing clipped sentences and red flag emojis. The whisper of Mariah Johnson's name in connection to a misconduct report was enough to send a chill through their most experienced handlers. They knew what she represented. Not scandal. Not vengeance. But influence. The kind of influence that never had to ask twice. As Mariah disembarked, she didn't look at Paige. Not out of pettiness, but because Paige no longer mattered. She had become a footnote in a larger conversation Mariah had spent her life building. The driver opened the car door wordlessly. Her assistant texted, landing confirmation received. All teams activated. We've already heard from the board. Mariah nodded, slid into the leather interior and closed the door. Behind her, the plane was just a machine again. Metal, glass, and fuel. But within it, something had changed. A boundary had been redrawn. A hierarchy disrupted. And it all started with a quiet call at cruising altitude. The wheels of the private jet kissed the tarmac with a soft screech. But the silence inside the cabin was louder than any noise the landing could make. And when the jet taxied to its designated spot at the far edge of the private hangar, the atmosphere within felt thick. Not just with the recirculated air of luxury flight, but with the tension of consequences settling like dust on leather seats and polished chrome. Mariah remained poised, legs crossed. Eyes trained on the window though, she wasn't really seeing the airport infrastructure scrolling by outside. Her mind was already in the next room, the next hour, the next headline. Her driver had already been pinged, the car idling at the base of the stairs, black paint gleaming, the tinted windows hiding the world's most dangerous force. A composed woman who'd been underestimated one too many times. The flight attendant, Paige, hovered awkwardly near the galley, glancing back at Mariah with a shifting mix of guilt and fear. Still unsure whether to speak, apologize, explain, or disappear, but Mariah offered no glance in return, no indulgence of eye contact or emotional closure, because closure was for people still in the same story. And Paige had been edited out, replaced by the growing machinery now surrounding Mariah's life like a fortress that could no longer be breached by casual disrespect. The jet's cabin door opened with a hiss, and the subtle whoosh of the outside air bleeding in felt like the break between acts in a Shakespearean drama. No curtain fall, no orchestra swell, just a shift in atmosphere so sharp you could feel it in your throat. As Mariah stood and gathered her handbag, a custom black leather piece that bore no label but cost more than Paige's annual salary, she didn't glance back at the others, didn't say goodbye, didn't need to, because her presence alone was the final line in that chapter. The staircase felt shorter than usual as she descended it, her heels clicking gently on each step like punctuation marks, and the moment her foot touched the tarmac, the world snapped back into motion. Her driver opened the car door without a word, and she slid into the back seat just as her assistant's voice filled her ear through the second AirPod. "We've got a situation," came the calm yet clipped tone of Elena, her chief communications officer. "The footage is already circulating on internal employee channels. Someone recorded the slap from Row 2, grainy, but it's unmistakable. We're pulling it, but someone leaked it to a private aviation gossip blog, and it's gaining traction." Mariah closed her eyes for a breath, not in frustration, but in calculation. "What's the tone?" she asked quietly. "Sympathy." Elena hesitated. "Yes. But it's starting to morph. People are trying to guess who you are. It's like lighting a fuse." Mariah opened her eyes slowly, watching the city skyline grow larger through the window as the car sped down the expressway. "Let it burn," she said, "but keep it controlled." By the time they reached her penthouse, the turmoil had metastasized. Her security team had already swept the building for press drones or digital intrusions. Inside, her executive team was assembled in the glass-walled strategy suite, looking like command staff at a military crisis table. Tablets open, graphs spinning, alerts pinging. No one asked how she was. They knew better. Mariah walked in and stood at the head of the table without removing her coat. Tell me. Elena stood up. We've confirmed Paige's employment history. 2 prior complaints for excessive force, 1 quiet NDA settlement involving a verbal altercation on a previous Skylux flight. Skylux is already trying to get ahead of it. They sent a groveling email this morning. Mariah smirked coldly. Of course they did. Arun, the COO, continued. Media inquiries are heating up. TMZ, late blogs, independent watchdogs, TikTok commentators, all looking for an identity. They haven't connected you yet, but it's inevitable. Mariah looked out the floor to ceiling window. The skyline reflected in her glass like a chessboard. Good. Let them speculate. When they find out who I am, I want it to feel like thunder after silence. What no one in the building knew yet was that Mariah had already begun laying down her counteroffensive, not through press releases, but through quieter, deeper channels. 1 call to the chair of the board of Skylux. 1 nudge to a diversity audit firm they'd been trying to avoid. 1 casual conversation with a powerful senator's chief of staff about FAA policy and employee conduct reviews. All seemingly unrelated moves, but each a loaded chamber. She wasn't just responding to a moment of personal disrespect. She was turning the entire ordeal into a mirror held up to an industry, and she knew exactly which levers to pull to make sure they looked. Meanwhile, the team debated tone and messaging. Should they lean into identity? Call it racism, sexism, classism, all 3. But Mariah raised a hand. I don't need pity. I need precision. She paused. We don't tell the world what happened to me. We show them who I am, and let them ask why someone like me could be mistaken for someone disposable. Her words landed like steel dropped in water. Calm but irreversible. Still, as night crept in and the city lights blinked on like a million digital eyes, Mariah knew that the real turmoil was only beginning. Not the kind in headlines, but the kind in boardrooms and private inboxes and sleepless conversations among executives who'd failed to recognize the magnitude of their mistake. Skylux, in its current form, was a castle built on discretion and elite clientele. But now one of those clients had turned the lights on, and the cracks in the walls were becoming embarrassingly visible. Their stockholders would feel it soon. Their partners were already whispering. Paige, meanwhile, had been put on immediate leave pending investigation, which was corporate code for, we're figuring out how to fire you without admitting we hired you. Maria didn't care about her punishment. What mattered was precedent. The next woman of color who boarded a private jet should never again be treated like a trespasser. And that required an example, not of Paige, of power. And yet, not all turmoil can be managed through strategy. Alone in her suite later that night, after the meetings had ended and the staff had left, Maria sat in the glow of a single lamp, staring at the ice melting in her untouched glass of whiskey. She didn't drink often, but tonight wasn't about habit. It was about marking a shift. Something had changed in the air. Not just in aviation, but in her. The slap, ridiculous as it seemed, had woken a deeper fury. One she'd buried long ago under success, under poise, under self-discipline and endless awards. But beneath all that lay a girl who'd once been told to use the service elevator, who'd once been mistaken for the caterer at her own product launch, who'd once had to prove, over and over, that brilliance in black skin wasn't an accident. And tonight, that girl was wide awake, staring back at her through the mirror. Not crying, not wounded, just watching, reminding her this isn't about revenge, it's about repair, and you are the architect. The storm had reached the ground, and Mariah was no longer hiding from it. She was the eye of it. It began not with a headline or a viral tweet, but with an update buried in a weekly shareholder report. An internal document circulated quietly among Skylux Aviation's board and major investors, filled with the usual forecasts, maintenance schedules and executive memos. But on page 6, tucked between fleet refurbishment costs and catering contract adjustments, sat a single line that altered the course of the company's history. New Class A shareholder, Maria A. Johnson Trust. No one noticed at first, not the PR intern scrambling to manage growing online rumors, not the vice president trying to prepare a statement vague enough to deflect blame, but specific enough to appear concerned, and certainly not Paige, now locked out of her company email, and already ghosted by the same managers who once praised her efficiency under pressure. But deep in the legal machinery of corporate ownership, the foundation of Skylux had begun to shift beneath their feet. Mariah had struck where it mattered most, not in courtrooms or press rooms, but in the balance sheets, the bylaws, the cap table. She wasn't suing the company, she was acquiring it. The move had been planned the moment she hung up from that call at cruising altitude. While her executive team was drafting statements, Mariah had already reached out to 2 of her private equity liaisons, and a silent partner she'd kept in her orbit for over a decade. A woman whose investment firm specialized in distressed luxury assets, and who had always told Maria, half-jokingly, "You should buy your enemies before they know they're for sale." And this time, Mariah wasn't just buying a plane. She was buying the power to rewrite the story. A 12% minority stake, purchased through an anonymized trust vehicle, then revealed days later with exacting theatricality. Just enough to secure a seat at the table. Just enough to demand answers. Just enough to introduce motions the current board would be forced to vote on. Because when a shareholder shows up asking about misconduct, liability, and HR patterns, especially one with public visibility and private muscle, the rest of the board doesn't look at the accused. They look at each other, calculating how quickly to throw someone under the nearest metaphorical bus. Mariah didn't announce it with a press conference. She didn't even leak it to the media. She simply appeared on the quarterly Zoom call, her camera off, microphone muted, watching as executives fidgeted with their ties and board members squinted at the attendance list, wondering who the M.A. Johnson Trust was and why legal counsel had texted them 15 minutes prior saying, "Say nothing about the incident." The meeting began like all others, with stiff introductions, a PowerPoint deck, a market outlook forecast. But then Mariah's camera flickered on, and for a moment, time stalled. The woman whose face had been on security footage, whispered about in break rooms, debated in Twitter threads, and defended by strangers, now stared directly into the eyes of the people who had once allowed her to be slapped without consequence. She said nothing for the first few seconds. She just looked. And in that silence, the balance of power tilted. "Good afternoon," she finally said, her voice smooth but unyielding. "I appreciate you allowing me a few minutes as a new stakeholder. I'll keep this brief." The room, both physical and virtual, froze. "Last week, while traveling aboard Skylux Jet 14A, I experienced a physical and racialized assault by one of your flight attendants. Since that time, I've received no formal acknowledgement of the event beyond a vague email from middle management and a boilerplate statement from legal." A cough cracked through someone's mic. Mariah didn't flinch. "So I made a decision. Not to sue, not to threaten, not to play the media game, but to buy in. Because unlike temporary outrage, ownership has staying power, and I intend to stay." A board member finally spoke, a man named Leland who'd been with the company since it operated 2 planes out of Arizona. "Ms. Johnson, with all due respect, we were under the impression this was an isolated incident. And certainly not one requiring direct board involvement." Mariah smiled slowly. "That's the problem, Leland. You assumed. And when assumptions are made about people like me, bad decisions follow." But she wasn't emotional. She wasn't even angry. What she radiated was clarity, refined, sharpened, and dangerous. She spoke next about policy inconsistencies, HR protection gaps, hiring patterns, and brand risk, not as a victim but as a strategist. Every point she raised came with data, every claim supported by documents her team had uncovered within 72 hours of the incident. She wasn't just challenging the board, she was outperforming them. And soon, their silence wasn't resistance, it was surrender. Because they knew deep down that she wasn't asking for a response. She was laying groundwork. For restructuring, for leadership change, for a cultural audit that would stretch from the tarmac to the top floor. And because her stake now made her a voting member, they'd be required to put those items on the agenda next quarter. The beauty of it all was its simplicity. While the world had expected Mariah to do what every other high-profile victim of discrimination had done, give an interview, file a lawsuit, write a thread, she'd done what only someone who had studied the system inside out could do. She'd rewritten the rules of engagement. And by the time the Zoom call ended, there was no question left in anyone's mind who held the reins now. Not the CEO, not the PR firm, not the investors with inherited wealth. It was the black woman they hadn't even bothered to check in on during the incident. The one they'd assumed was just another passenger, the one they'd mistaken for someone without leverage. And now, as emails flew and calls were made, the tremor moved beyond Skylux. Other private jet companies began issuing internal memos about passenger sensitivity. Investors reviewed their own diversity training protocols. HR consultants booked emergency sessions. Because power doesn't exist in a vacuum, it ripples. Still, while the business world buzzed, Mariah remained where she always did, in control, behind the scenes, guiding the narrative without becoming consumed by it. She held no press conference, made no public statement. All she did was post one photo, no caption, on her private Instagram account, a shot of her hand resting on a luxury jet interior's armrest. The same hand Paige had slapped, now adorned with a gold ring bearing the Skylux insignia. The message was clear to those who knew how to read between the pixels. She hadn't just taken the hit. She'd taken ownership. Back in her office days later, Mariah sat alone with a fresh batch of reports. This time about fleet performance, charter bookings, and employee turnover at Skylux. She glanced at the figures, nodded. Make sure the board gets a gift. Elena blinked. A gift? Yes, something classy. Crystal maybe. A decanter, with a note. Alina scribbled. And what will the note say? Mariah smiled. Let's keep it simple. To new beginnings. Because this wasn't the end of a scandal. It was the start of a transformation. Not just of one company, but of every assumption about who gets to sit at the table, who gets to own the plane, and who gets to call the meeting to order. The letter arrived not in a flurry of news or in a grand televised gesture, but quietly, almost sheepishly, slipped into Mariah's inbox on a rainy Monday morning, buried between meeting confirmations and property acquisition alerts. It was from the CEO of Skylux Aviation. A man whose name she barely remembered despite the fact that he had likely discussed her existence behind closed doors more in the past month than he had thought about any single black woman in his adult life. The subject line read, "Personal apology and request for dialogue." A line crafted by some damage control strategist who believed that the right font, tone, and flattery could rewind the irreversible. Mariah didn't open it right away. She stared at it for a moment, sipping her espresso, the rain tapping against the tall glass windows of her penthouse, like the distant echo of regret trying to find a way in. But what those executives didn't understand, what they never did, was that there comes a point in every story when the apology becomes not just insufficient, but irrelevant. A point where the person you hurt has already rewritten their life without you in it. A point where the damage isn't a wound, but a map to a higher floor you can't access anymore. When she finally clicked it open, the letter was exactly what she expected. Measured, formal, overflowing with regret, sincerity, and the kind of passive phrasing that admits nothing while pretending to say everything. Would deeply regret the unfortunate incident aboard Flight 14A. It began, as though someone had spilled coffee, not slapped a passenger. The behavior of our employee was not reflective of our values. A sentence so formulaic it may as well have been trademarked. We are taking steps to ensure this never happens again. Which, Mariah thought, meant, we're terrified of losing clients with money. But the most insulting part wasn't the words. It was the timing. Now that the world knew who she was, now that her silent acquisition had shifted the board's balance, now that whispers of a total corporate overhaul were leaking into the press. Now they wanted to talk. Now they wanted to connect. But where was this letter when she was crying silently in that plush leather seat, trying to process being struck in public without response? Where was this outreach when she disembarked without so much as a courtesy word from the crew? Where were these carefully chosen phrases, when the world had not yet learned her name, when she was just a black woman with no first-class label, no logo attached to her wrist, no shield of wealth visible on the surface? Maria didn't respond. Not at first. Not that day. She let the apology sit. Let it gather digital dust in the inbox where empty words go to die, because what the CEO failed to realize, what so many in power fail to grasp, is that apologies have half-lives. Their power decays with every minute they're withheld, and by the time they're given under pressure, they aren't bridges. They're tombstones. Markers of a moment when someone realized they miscalculated who they thought they could step over. She forwarded the message to Alina without comment. File it, she said simply. We'll address it at the board meeting. And with that, she returned to her schedule. She had deals to close, charities to fund, and a private think tank to meet regarding her upcoming initiative on representation in executive aviation leadership. An initiative born from pain, now fueling change, the kind that rewires industries and shatters ceilings without ever raising its voice. But the apologies didn't stop there. Over the next week, they came like rainfall. Unsolicited emails from board members who had been silent during the Zoom call, letters from PR firms representing the company's brand partners, even a voicemail from Paige's attorney, requesting a confidential, healing conversation between the two women, as though the solution to violence was a carefully curated Zoom therapy session in which Paige could cry about the pressure of her job and ask for forgiveness in exchange for absolution. Mariah deleted the voicemail without listening to the full minute. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Forgiveness is a powerful thing, but it is never owed. And certainly not when the only motivation is public shame. Paige hadn't reached out when the footage went viral. She hadn't tried to understand her actions in the days that followed. She had disappeared into the protective folds of whiteness, hoping silence would preserve her until the storm passed. But the storm hadn't passed. It had transformed. It had a face now, a name, a seat at the table. Even the media tried to enter the apology parade. A well-known talk show host reached out through intermediaries, offering Mariah a full-hour segment to tell her story. Another celebrity known for performative allyship tweeted her support, tagging Mariah in a post that read, "We see you, Queen. This never should have happened, Paul." But Mariah didn't retweet. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't join the trending hashtag. She understood something deeper than most people did, that there is power in withholding the story until you are the one writing the book. And hers was still unfolding, in boardrooms and brokerage offices and back-channel conversations where the real decisions get made. She didn't need a podium. She had a portfolio. Still, the part no one saw, the part the public never glimpsed, was what happened late at night, when the world went quiet, and Mariah sat in her apartment alone, reliving the slap not as a political event or a business pivot, but as a moment of deep, personal violation. It wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the humiliation. The reminder that no matter how far she climbed, someone always felt entitled to push her back down. And it haunted her not because it made her doubt her worth, but because it made her remember every time it had happened before, the teacher who asked if her essay was really her own, the investor who told her to dial down the anger when she pitched with passion, the hotel concierge who asked for her room number twice while smiling at the white couple behind her. The slap had reopened 1,000 cuts. And some nights, that weight pressed against her ribcage like an anchor. Not enough to drown her. Just enough to remind her of the depths she'd learned to swim through. One evening, a package arrived, no return address, hand-delivered by courier. Inside was a handwritten letter from Paige. The ink was smudged in one corner as though she had wept while writing. It began, "I don't expect forgiveness but I need to try," and continued with 5 pages of reflection, apology, context, excuses wrapped in sincerity. Maria read it once, slowly, then folded it and placed it in a drawer with other artifacts of a life spent being misjudged, mishandled, underestimated. She didn't need to read it again. She had lived it already. She wasn't cruel. But she wasn't here to comfort her assailant's guilt. She was here to shift the culture that created her in the first place. Weeks later, as the company prepared to unveil a new executive code of conduct and announce the elevation of Mariah to a newly created role, strategic equity advisor, there was a press conference. Not one she asked for, one they begged her to attend. And as she stood behind the podium, reporters flashing cameras, executives flanking her nervously, she began with a single, devastating sentence. "This isn't a comeback story, because I never left." The room froze. She continued, "I've been flying for years, building for decades, investing in a future where women like me don't have to prove we belong. And if it took a slap to wake this industry up, then let it be the last one any of us ever endure in silence." The applause that followed was thunderous. But Mariah wasn't performing for them. She wasn't interested in claps or headlines. She was rewriting systems, recasting roles, and reclaiming space. Apologies, she had learned, were a currency best spent early. Because once the person you hurt rises above you, your regret becomes not a bridge, but a gravestone etched with the words "too late." It wasn't about revenge, not really, not anymore. As Mariah stood in the glass-walled Skylux Aviation Executive Lounge, watching her private jet being prepped on the tarmac with the practiced choreography of engineers and attendants moving in synchronized professionalism, she felt something that was not pride or vindication but serenity. She had arrived at a height far greater than the one defined by altitude or corporate status. She had ascended into a rare space where identity, power, and peace no longer had to clash. The chaos of the past weeks had crystallized into an unshakable clarity. The woman who had once been mistaken for a domestic worker, a passenger with no pull, a nobody in a branded tracksuit, now moved through this world not just with agency, but with gravity. She didn't orbit power. It orbited her. Above them now didn't mean aloofness or cruelty. It meant liberation. It meant that their perception of her no longer mattered. Their voices could no longer cage her, and their late apologies and flurried attempts at reconciliation no longer had the strength to touch her soul. The slap had been real, but so was the transformation it triggered. The trauma had not consumed her, it had evolved her. Now, she moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to bend systems without being broken by them, how to rewrite policy while keeping her own story sacred, and how to glide through worlds that once tried to tether her to their ceilings. The private jet that awaited her wasn't just another plane. It was a rebranded flagship of Skylux's new equity initiative, one that Mariah herself had co-authored and strategically placed into the company's post-scandal overhaul. It bore a subtle new logo, a phoenix motif she had commissioned, a symbol of rebirth that no longer asked for permission to rise. No press releases had explained the symbolism, But every high-level executive and global partner understood the message. They knew she had reshaped the company from within. They knew this aircraft wasn't merely a plane, but a signal to every gatekeeper in every industry that their era of unchecked bias had expired. This was what, above them now, looked like. Not shouting on social media, not playing the token on diversity brochures, but owning the jet, steering the future, and never asking to be believed. As she walked toward the boarding stairs, staff parted respectfully, not out of fear but because her presence demanded reverence. There was no tension, no performative groveling. They addressed her as Ms. Johnson, not because it was a protocol, but because it was a declaration of who she had become in full view of the world. In the plush interior of the aircraft, her initials were embroidered subtly into the headrest of Seat 1A. She hadn't asked for that. It had simply appeared after one of the newly appointed flight managers, a young Afro-Latina woman Maria had personally recruited, said, "We just thought it was time the jet knew your name, too." And in that quiet, tasteful flourish, Maria saw more than a gesture. She saw the ripple effect of a system she had disrupted. She saw the women who would follow. The girls who would sit in airports one day dreaming not of escape but of command. She saw the long arc of erasure bending toward legacy. For the first time in years she exhaled fully. Not in exhaustion but in victory. The kind of victory that doesn't need to be screamed from rooftops because it echoes in boardrooms and bank statements. In corporate bylaws and cultural policy. She had elevated herself without compromising the core of who she was. Black, brilliant, soft where she chose to be, sharp where she needed to be. And she did it without begging for seats at tables built to exclude her. She built her own, then invited in the ones who had been denied too long. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty. It was intentional. She had instructed her team not to schedule any calls for the next 3 hours. No interviews, no press follow-ups, no strategy huddles. She didn't need to respond to the latest think pieces dissecting her impact, or the academic panels unpacking the Maria Johnson effect on aviation. She had already spoken with her actions. What was left to do now was something few powerful women are ever afforded: to sit, to breathe, to enjoy what she had created. She sipped champagne not as a symbol of wealth, but as a toast to perseverance. Each bubble was a reminder of a day survived, a ceiling cracked, a lie dismantled. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines hummed to life, and she let her head rest back, eyes closing. Not in weariness, but in meditation. Above her, the sky stretched infinite. Beneath her, the runway blurred. Around her, the air whispered a single truth: she had become untouchable in the way only those who have fully known their own vulnerability ever can. Even now, people were still trying to catch up to her narrative. Journalists scarred her past looking for the moment she became powerful. Executives tried to understand what made her different. They didn't realize the answer wasn't in a moment. It was in a lifetime. In every insult she didn't respond to, every room where she was doubted but never flinched, every time she decided to keep building instead of crumbling. They were looking for a turning point. But what made Maria Johnson untouchable wasn't a moment. It was accumulation. A life's worth of quiet defiance, strategic patience, and relentless excellence. And now, as the plane angled up through the clouds, piercing layers of airspace like metaphorical barriers made literal, she smiled at the irony. The same company that had once made her feel small now bore her imprint in every cabin protocol, every anti-bias training, every equity hire. The same executives who had once ignored her now waited on her shareholder memos like sermons. The same flight attendant who had humiliated her now sat in mandatory behavioral counseling while her name hung on a policy titled the Johnson Clause. An industry-shifting rule that mandated passenger respect protocols regardless of perceived status. No, this wasn't revenge. This was architecture, this was permanence. What she built would last beyond the outrage cycle. It would shape standards long after her name faded from headlines. And perhaps, in that way, the slap that once tried to reduce her to a caricature of anger and fragility had instead ensured her influence would be permanent. Not just because she fought back, but because she leveled up. Because she chose not to play a game stacked against her. Because she became bigger than the insult. Louder than the silence. Stronger than the shame. She had transcended the insult not by ignoring it, but by transforming it into a platform. And as she reached for her journal, a leather-bound notebook she had carried long before her name held weight, she jotted only one line before closing her eyes again. They saw a passenger. I became the pilot. No flourish. No preamble. Just fact. Above them now didn't mean she had forgotten. It didn't mean she didn't still carry the echo of that moment. It meant she had rerouted her pain into power. And power, once earned and claimed on your own terms, becomes its own atmosphere. She lived in it now. She flew through it. And when her name was spoken in the halls of aviation, corporate law, or cultural equity, it was no longer whispered in pity or mentioned in passing. It was carved into the blueprint, not as a cautionary tale, but as a declaration: this is how we rise.